Hello everyone! In this lesson, we will learn how to set up a per user post limit so that each user account can only create so many posts. There are a lot of different reasons why you would want to set this up. Maybe to prevent malicious users from creating 30 million posts just to try to slow down or break your website, or even just to prevent innocent non-malicious users who are creating more posts than you would like. Okay, so in this window I'm logged in with my subscriber account, and if I visit the My Notes page, at the moment I have 4 existing note posts. And let's imagine that we want to limit things so that each user account can only have a maximum of 5 note posts. You could choose a different limit like 10 or 20 or 30, okay, but the question is, how can we implement a per user post limit? Well, the first step is to jump into our text editor, and within our theme folder, I want you to jump into functions.php. And let's scroll down to the very bottom of this file, because remember that we've already set up a filter that allows us to intercept requests right before data gets saved into the WordPress database. And we've already used our filter function to make sure that note posts must be private, as well as sanitize the title and content fields. So now let's just use our filter function once again to make sure that a user account cannot create more than 5 note posts. Now it's important to point out that this filter hook is going to run for every post type, and we only want to implement a per user limit for the note post type. So we want to make sure that any code we're about to write lives within this basic if check. So right within this first if statement, let's add a new line, and I'm actually going to write a brand new if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets, and for the condition check, let's say if the current user already has more than 4 note posts, if that's true, then within the if statement, we can just completely exit and quit the current request so that no new post gets created. Let me show you how I would set that up. So within the condition, let's say if, and WordPress has a function named count user posts, and it's a function, so it gets its own set of parentheses. And we want to give this function 2 things. So A, B, right? 2 arguments. The first argument is which user account you're trying to count the posts of. So instead of this placeholder A, let's say get current user ID, right? Whichever user is sending off this request. Okay, and then the second argument is which post type you want to count. So are we trying to count how many blog posts this user has created or how many professor posts they've created? No, we want to count how many note posts they've created. So instead of the placeholder B, let's just say note. Okay, so this code that we've highlighted now will return a number of how many note posts they've already created, and then let's just say if that number is greater than 4, or whatever you want to set the limit to, just choose 1 less than. Okay, so if the user has already created more than 4 posts, then within the if statement, we just want to completely exit out or cancel the current request. And we can do that by simply calling a PHP function named die. And within the parentheses, we can actually include a message that will be passed along to the user. So let's just say you have reached your note limit. Okay, and die will prevent anything else from happening. So none of this code below it will even run. The filter function will not return any data and no new posts or updates will be made. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So at the moment, my subscriber account currently has created 4 note posts. So I should be able to create at least 1 more, right? 5th post test, lorem ipsum, click create. Okay, that was created successfully, but if I try to create another one, I should be over my limit. So limit test, lorem ipsum, create. So nothing happens, and if I check my console, there's the congrats message from the 5th post that we created a moment ago, but then when I tried to create the 6th post, we see sorry, And if we expand this and read the response text, we see you have reached your note limit. Perfect. So our new code successfully prevented us from creating another post. However, before we move on, let's test out our edit and delete buttons for existing posts now that we've reached our limit. So for example, if I try to delete this 5th post test that I just created, I click delete, but nothing happens. And if I check the console, we see sorry. And if I expand this message, the response text is you have reached your note limit. Now clearly this is not what we want, and this is a bit confusing, right? Because I wasn't trying to create a new post, I was just trying to delete one of my existing posts. And I should always be able to delete a post no matter how many posts I currently have. So let's jump back to our code and analyze what's going wrong. So in WordPress, when you move a post into the trash, right, which is the first step towards deleting a post, in order to move that post into the trash, WordPress has to edit its post status and set it to trash. Why am I telling you this? Well, it's because this WP insert post data filter hook not only runs when you try to create a new post, but it also runs anytime you try to update a post. So the problem and why we were unable to delete a post is because we are currently at our limit, right? We've got 5 posts, and when we sent that delete request, WordPress tried to edit the post and set its status to trash. But because this evaluated to true, right, because we were over our limit, WordPress wasn't able to set the status to trash because instead our die function ran and canceled everything. So all we need to do to fix things is make our if statement a bit less aggressive. So instead of only checking to see if the post count is greater than 4, let's also check to see if the incoming request is to create a brand new post instead of just updating an existing post. So after this is the count greater than 4, but still within the parentheses, let's say and to add on another condition check. And unfortunately, there is no super easy intuitive way of doing this. We can't just say and if the request equals create, right? That doesn't exist in WordPress. That was wishful thinking. So instead, we need to get creative. We need to ask ourselves, how can we differentiate between an existing post and a brand new post that is yet to actually be created? And after scratching our heads and thinking about this for a moment, we would realize that an existing post would have an ID number, whereas a brand new post that hasn't actually been created yet, it would not have an ID. Now, unfortunately, the data array that contains information about the requested post, right, this array that gets passed into our function, it does not contain the ID of the post. But luckily, this filter hook passes along a second array of data into our function. So within our function definition, within the parentheses, right after data, let's say comma and include a second parameter. Let's name it post ARR for post array. Okay, and this contains slightly different information about the requested post. Luckily for us, it does contain the ID number. So within our if statement, right after the and for our second condition check, let's say post ARR, look inside it with square brackets and capital ID. Now, as long as an ID number exists, this will evaluate to true. But if we want to check for the opposite of that, we can just put an exclamation mark right before it. Okay, now before we save this and test it out, we just need to do one more thing. In order for our function to actually access 2 parameters instead of just 1, we need to make a change to this line of code where we add the filter. So right after the second argument where we specify our callback function, let's add a comma. And first we need to provide a priority. Let's just say 10, which is the default. I will explain what this 10 means in just a moment. The important part is we also want to include another argument and say 2. This 2 represents that we want this function to be able to work with 2 parameters. By default, it's only set to 1. So this way we actually have access to the post array. Okay, now back to this 10 because we didn't really explain that. This is the priority of the callback function that you're setting. Really, this is only ever an issue if you're setting multiple functions to run on the same filter hook. So for example, you don't need to do this. I'm only going to do this for demonstration reasons, but if we duplicated this line and said that we wanted to add another filter to that same hook, and then change the name of the function that we want to call, well, then the priority number decides which function would run first. So the lower the number, the earlier it will run, and the larger the number, the later it will run. Again, for our purposes, this doesn't really matter. It's just something I want you to be aware of. So let me delete that. Now let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So back on the front end, I'm at my limit. I've got 5 posts. Let me try to delete this one again. Cool, it was successful. Now let me add another post so I'm at my limit again, and then let's try to make an edit to an existing post. Limit test once again, lorem ipsum, create it. Okay, let's try to make an edit to it. So modified title, click save. Perfect, that was successful as well. And if I try to create a 6th post, hopefully the server denies me. So 6th post attempt, testing, click create. Nothing happens. If I check the console, we see sorry. Cool, so our limit policy is taking effect. Now just a quick warning, the remainder of this lesson has nothing to do with WordPress. Now I just want to focus on creating a nicer user experience with a bit of JavaScript. And what I mean is, if someone tries to create a post and it fails like this, they don't necessarily know that they are over the limit. So they might just click create, and when it doesn't work, they would be confused and frustrated. The average user doesn't know to check the console and check the error message and see, oh, you have reached your note limit. So why don't we use JavaScript so that if this message is received, right, this exact you have reached your note limit, if that happens, then maybe we output a bit of text right here that reads, you have reached your limit. Delete a note to make room for a new one. So right now, let's go edit the PHP template that outputs this page in this form. So back in our text editor, let's jump into page mynotes.php. And here's the create a new note form. And down at the very bottom, below the last span, let's create a new line. And let's create a brand new span and say note limit reached. Delete an existing note to make room for a new one. Okay, and let's be sure to give the opening span tag a class of note limit message. This will give it a bit of CSS that makes the text red, but also it will make it so this element is hidden when the page first loads. And then we will need to use JavaScript to actually reveal or display it. Okay, so let's save that, and even if you refresh the My Notes page, again, that text that we just added sits right here, but it is hidden by default. So now let's write a bit of JavaScript so that if we send out a request and the response text is you have reached your limit, then we reveal that error message right here. So in our text editor, within our JavaScript modules folder, let's jump into My Notes. And let's scroll down and find our create note method. Here it is. And within our Ajax request, let's look for our error property, which is a function that will run only if the request is not successful. And within this error function, maybe right above this console.log, let's add a new line and set up an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets, and let's say if response text. If you're wondering how I know to check for this exact name, you can just jump back into your browser and send off a request that you know will fail because you're over the limit, and then check your console. If you expand the official response and then scroll down, our message of you reached your note limit lives inside a property named response text. Okay, so back in our code, let's say if response.responseText equals, and then instead of typing it out, let's just copy and paste this exact value. So copy that into my clipboard, paste it in. Okay, so if we receive this exact error message, then within the body of this if statement, let's use jQuery to select that hidden bit of text that sits right here. And we just want to reveal it. So we'll use jQuery to select an element that has a class of note limit message. And let's give it a class. So add class of active, which will reveal it or display it. Okay, let's be sure to add a semicolon at the end of that line, and let's save this. And then back in the browser, be sure to refresh or even perform a hard refresh. Okay, and let's try to send off a request that we know should fail because we're over our limit. So create note. Perfect. We see that error message text right in the user interface. So we're telling users they've reached their limit and they should delete an existing note to make room for a new one. So finally, why don't we set things up so that if they actually delete one of their notes, and that brings their note total to be less than 5, then let's remove this error message on the fly. Now, you and I know that anytime you successfully make a request to the REST API, it responds back with all sorts of data about that post. So if a user deletes one of their notes to make room for a new note, it would be nice if the response that the REST API sends back included a count of how many notes that user now has. Well, by default, WordPress doesn't do that, right? It only sends back things like the title, the content, the permalink, the slug. But luckily, it's very easy for us to customize what the REST API responds with. So let me show you what we're going to do. In our text editor, back in functions.php, I'm going to scroll up to the very top. But for you, it might be somewhere else in your file, but I want you to pause the video really quick and find your function that is named University Custom REST. This is a function that we set up way back in the course when we wanted the REST API to give us the author name for each post. So you may not remember this, but we used something named register REST field to add a new field or property to the REST API response. So right now, let's just duplicate these 3 lines, the register REST field lines. Copy that, right below it, just paste it to duplicate it. And I'm going to modify this to fit my needs. So this first property is the post type that you want to add something to. So instead of post, it's the note post type, right? Then we get to make up the name for the new property that gets returned. So instead of author name, let's say user note count. Okay, and then its get callback is a function that returns whatever the value should be. So instead of returning get the author, let's delete that and return count user posts. And remember, we give this 2 arguments. The first is which user you want to count for. So get current user ID. And then the second argument is which post type you want to count. So let's say note. Okay, now if we save this, that new property named user note count will be available to us. So just as a quick test, if you try to edit one of your existing posts and then check the console, well, within the WordPress response, there should now be a new property named user note count with a relevant value. Okay, now let's go use this value within our delete note JavaScript method. Remember that if a user deletes a note, and then they are below their limit, we want to remove this error message on the fly. So back in our JavaScript, our myNotes file, let's look for our delete note method. Here it is. And within the success function, it doesn't really matter where, but maybe below this console.log line, let's set up an if statement. So if parentheses, curly brackets, and let's say if response.user note count is less than 5, well, then what do we want to do? We want to target the element with a class of note limit message, and we want to get rid of the class that makes it visible. So remove class active. Okay, let's go ahead and save this and then perform a hard refresh on the front end. Okay, so I'm at my limit. So if I try to create a new post, the error message appears, right? But then if I delete one of my existing posts to make room, cool, that error message disappears on the fly, and now I successfully can create that new note. And that's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we are really going to change gears and work on a new feature where subscriber accounts can like or heart or favorite a professor. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.